I know, I've heard the complaints. Unreal Engine sucks, nanite sucks, lumen sucks. And a quick search result will reveal this sentiment, but is it in actuality a fact? The answer? No. The truth is we've all simply been using these features wrong for so long. Now I could end the video there, but we're gonna go deep with this one. Videos like this will have you believe under no circumstance should you ever use these features. There's no way to optimize these features. Turn nanite off. And he's not alone. This is a growing sentiment, but why? Before we go any further, I think we need to go mask off with this one. Now that is better. Some context will do us some good too. With the growing rate of channels popping up, I do think some credentials are in order here. Now, I'm not some random YouTuber with zero experience making myself out to be some guru like some other creators have done. No. I'm a principal environment artist in both virtual production and games with 14 years experience in Unreal Engine, with clients such as ILM, Netflix, Amazon, and so on. I'm not some hobbyist masquerading as a big shot, no. Optimizing environment workflows and pipelines is quite literally what I do for a living. Now I know everyone wants to see the breakdown, however, I should provide a caveat. Now this graph I actually got from another creator, Ascendant, whose channel I'll link in the description down below. This graph, if you're a developer, save it. It's very simple, but this is the best summary of nanite. You see, nanite and lumen are not bad, and they're also not broken. They're simply being used on projects which don't fully take advantage of it, and projects which could take full advantage of it are also not utilizing it properly. Now with that, let's dive in with case number 1. Now we're going to be looking at 4 separate case studies, each surrounding foliage. Now it's also important to note that this engine is the one in which we're using to develop our own game. Now this isn't a custom build or anything, it's just the default engine, but that note is going to become important a bit later on. So case number 1, we have just simple standing foliage. So again, why foliage? The reason we're going about foliage with this case is because foliage is going to be some of the most widespread geometry in your entire environment, right? You play any game, you develop any game, you figure you have meadows, forests, grasslands, things like that. You're going to have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more of these assets scattered around. They're oftentimes pain points, not just in creation, but also, especially in optimization. This is the typical sort of foliage types that you're going to see in any game, right? This is kind of the quality that we're kind of used to seeing, and this is the sort of look that we're used to seeing. But if we take a look deeper at this, what does the geometry actually look like? And that's the most important thing here. So if we go here, this is what the actual geometry looks like. When you're playing a game, your foliage, your grass, your plants, your trees, they're going to have what are called masked materials on them. The reason being is because traditionally modeling out a blade of grass, modeling out, a fern or leaves, it was not really acceptable. The way in which we had to develop these foliage assets is we had to reduce the level of detail on the geometry, and we had to try to put as much detail we could in the actual material, in the shaders, in the textures. And that's where things have really not just changed, they've gone complete reverse. And we'll get into that in a moment. Now, so these are what would be referred to as LOD types, LOD foliage, meaning levels of detail. So basically, the further away we would get from an asset like this, the less and less topology these assets would have. And if you're using a separate game engine, you should still be using this method. The other method should only really be used when using nanite. So again, this is what we're used to seeing. This is what we're used to developing. However, when creating nanite assets, the way in which we should be developing going forward are foliage assets that look like this. So as we can see here, there aren't any cutouts. There's not any, mask trickery going on. This is full modeled geometry. And you might look at this and as an artist, as a developer, maybe even as a gamer, and look at this and say, nah, that can't be right. And trust me, as an artist myself that has to make these assets, it took a bit to go through the mental gymnastics of making this, because we've been so trained to think that the more polygons, the more, the higher resolution a mesh is, the more it's going to hit our frame rates, and the less and less we should really be doing that. So this is how Nanite wants you to be developing your assets. We see here that every sort of pine needle is modeled, every fern leaf is modeled, every blade of grass is modeled. And we go in here to Nanite visualization, we look at the triangles, and you can see how dense this is. However, again, with Nanite, it says we don't care about that. Just don't use masked materials. And the problem is, when we are using masked materials, that's when Nanite really has a problem. And this is one of the reasons as to why games still that are being developed in Unreal Engine 5 aren't really running how people really would hope, nor are really getting the details in which people would hope. Because again, so many workflows have been for so long wrapped around making assets like this, which again, if you are not using Nanite or Lumen, you want to be doing this. So again, this is how we're used to making it. This is how it should be made now. So let's go into some practical examples. Next example I'm going to show is going to be an actual environment with all non-nanite geometry. We're going to take a look at the frame rates, and we're going to talk about it a bit. So let's jump into that. This case study number 2, this is the foliage in which we're accustomed to seeing. This is the masked foliage. This is the foliage which, if you're a gamer, you've seen in basically every other game. If you're a foliage artist, this is the foliage which you've grown accustomed to creating. And if you're a developer, this is the kind of foliage in which you're probably using in your game right now. And I threw it in this little test scene I made, it took about 30 minutes. And the idea behind Nanite and Lumen, I think the sort of expectation is at least that it was going to be the sort of silver bullet, right? That no matter the geometry, no matter what we put in, Nanite is just going to fix it and everything's going to run well. When in actuality, it's kind of become the opposite, especially for these traditional pipelines, which again, we're so accustomed to utilizing when creating assets, where Nanite and Lumen actually require special considerations. One thing in which Epic hasn't necessarily stated, at least not like too directly, is that Unreal Engine is heading into a entirely quote unquote virtual pipeline. We got virtual shadow maps, we got virtual meshes, we got virtual textures. And in doing that, there are special considerations. So before we get into those, let's first look at the frame rates and let's go ahead and press play. So first of all, here in editor mode, if we take a look, we're getting about 42 frames per second, which you might be looking at this and thinking, well, this is a lot of grass. Games probably aren't going to have this dense of grass, and you're probably right. However, for the example, I wanted to kind of stress test it a bit. And so here we have densely clustered grass, and we're getting about 42 frames per second on high settings. And once we hit play, we're going to lose a bit of those frames. Now, to be fair, in editor, when you hit play, it's not going to run as well as if you press play outside of editor, if you launch game, if you package it. But that being said, playing in editor is a bit quicker for the example, so that's why we're doing it here. But here we can see in game, we get this frame rate drop to about 28, 30 frames a second, which isn't really ideal. Why are we getting frames like this? And what are some of the current fixes that developers are going to be using? So first and foremost, one of the things in which developers do is they think that the way in which to use quote unquote nanite foliage is to just convert all this into nanite. And very tempting because it's literally this easy. You just right click on your grass, right click, nanite, and you enable nanite. And that is traditionally what a lot of people are doing. It's a very common mistake to just take this foliage and just, right click, nanite, enable, and then say, well, my foliage is nanite. Why isn't it working? And the reason is because, again, nanite hates anything masked. If you're using masked on nanite, it doesn't like it. And so how can we see that? Why doesn't it like it? So we can go over here to nanite visualization, and we can look at the overdraw. And this is probably what you see when other creators try debunking nanite, right? Because again, this is what they're used to creating. This is the sort of traditional pipeline, if you will. So they're used to creating assets this way, and then they just right-click, turn to nanite, and then they say, well, what the heck? Why isn't it working? Again, the reason is because things have to be done a different way, which we'll take a look at in a bit. This is, it hurts the eyes just looking at it, right? And this is what's telling you that there's too much overlap, right? This is the overdraw view mode. And nanite hates overdraw. We need to reduce this overdraw as much as possible. And with all this white, this is just a big glaring no-no. And so we go back over here if we go over here to just look at the geometry, we can see that the actual grass cards are actually pretty tight when it comes to LOD 0 to the highest resolution of it, but it's still using a masked texture. And then the trees are still using a masked texture. And again, we're getting these lower frame rates that are not really ideal. And what you're probably going to do is try to just reduce some of the grass clustering. And in fact, one of the things in which you might have already tried if you're a developer, it's something that I certainly tried, is reducing the poly count even further of the grass, right? You want to get it down to like 100 triangles for your grass cards or something like that. And, reducing the trees, pretty drastically as well. And you'll notice that like you might get like, 5 frames back or something, but you're not getting that boost you want. And so what happens is developers either say, we're not using nanite, we're going back to LODs, or they might say, we're not using lumen either, we're going to use some other solution. So with that being said, let's go over to the next case study. This is use case number 3. This is the identical environment to the last one. The only thing we did is swap the foliage for the nanite foliage. And to go a step further even, because the nanite foliage is actually smaller than the masked foliage from the last one, I actually had to paint even more foliage clusters in this environment to give a similar sort of look of fullness. And on top of that even, I increased the scalability settings like the view distance, to the max, increased the shading quality a little bit as well. So we have higher settings, we have more instances, we have a lot more geometry, and we also have more than double the frame rate. Whereas before we were getting like 40 frames, now we're getting like 80 to 90 frames. And so why is that? How is this working? And what sort of wizardry is this? So let's go in here into triangles. And if we look at this, we also have grass movement. It's pretty subtle, I will admit, but we have grass movement going on. But if we look at the geometry, there's no masked anything going on here. This is simply opaque materials. This is full, complete, modeled out geometry. This is fully modeled grass. And that's really what Epic wants us to be doing. This is the sort of workflow of the future, if you will, for developing foliage. And it's simply just not the workflow that foliage artists are utilizing right now. And again, the reason we're not is because it's been instilled in us for so long not to do this. Like I said, literally every other game engine, you don't want to do this. You'll probably get yelled at for doing this if you're using any other engine. However, if you want to use nanite, if you want to get the most out of nanite and lumen, then this is really what you want to be doing. Now again, this workflow is not for everyone. It's not for every project. You don't want this foliage for your, low poly stylized, game, your mobile game. That's not what this is used for. This specific nanite foliage and all that is better used in, like RPG games or just games generally speaking that have a quote unquote like photoreal aesthetic. And if you're curious also how big this environment is, are you thinking, well, maybe this is just like a small environment, he's bluffing, this isn't really that big. It's a pretty big environment. It's pretty sizable. And, to further the point even more, if I zoom out, I get even more frames here. And again, all these trees, these are all nanite trees. And we're getting higher frames. So, let's say you're making an RPG game and you want to do a big vista point, you really don't want to be doing billboards, right? You don't want to be having, for those of you that aren't aware, billboards are basically just like flat card cutouts for the distance. And this goes against everything that we've all been taught, right? But you want to be using model geometry. You want to be using that full detailed geometry. And the more you use it, the more use you're going to get out of it. The problem with the developmental workflow of nanite right now is projects tend to use nanite partially, only kinda, right? We're going to use nanite on maybe highly detailed rocks and those types of solid objects, but we're not using it in foliage. We're not using it on certain asset types which we should be using it on. And that's really where we're headed going into the future, I believe, as this sort of workflow becomes more and more known, as these sorts of assets become more and more approachable to create as well. On that topic as well, I do have a video planned after this teaching you how to create nanite foliage as it is a separate sort of workflow. If you're really questioning this, I really implore you to sort of recreate this example. Get some, maybe bring in some nanite foliage, maybe, watch my tutorial after this showing you how to create nanite foliage and recreate your own environment, do your own tests. And at the end of the day, if you really want to know what works, do the tests. That's the best way you can possibly ever know what works, what doesn't work without question. Now, we're going to go on to the next one. Case number 4 is going to be a little different, as I think it's important to view things in context. So we're going to be looking at an actual game environment. The game environment in question is from our own game, Hidden Empire. And what I'm about to show you is still very, very early on in development, with its own optimizations outside of foliage to go, as well as various set changes and world building elements missing. Specifically, the map in question is merely the starting town for our demo you and your friends will spawn into before traversing the dungeons, which is where the bulk of our work has been focused. However, the main game is going to be much, much larger. So I present to you case number 4. So this is case number 4, and again, this is very early on in development. There's plenty of optimizations to go, plenty of features and various different world buildings, and especially characters to go to be added to this. Now, that being said, again, I wanted to just show you this in context. And as we can see here, we're getting about 85, 87 frames per second just here in editor mode. And we have the nanite foliage. We also have, basically everything nanite, including nanite landscape, which we didn't really talk about. And maybe we'll get into in another video, but the nanite landscape, the nanite displacement works really well. We get a lot of really nice details like these rocks just from the material alone. And if we come over here and take a look at this a bit further, and we can see this is how dense this is. And this is the crazy thing with nanite, is this is actually what you're encouraged to do. Any other game engine, you do not want to be doing this. You don't want to have your landscape nearly this dense, anywhere near this dense. Nanite encourages it. In fact, it wants you to utilize it. This is where the sort of shortcoming with development is coming from in regards to using Unreal Engine 5, as well as using nanite. And this is where game developers are sort of heading towards, is becoming more comfortable with this full process, with using the displacements, with using nanite landscape, and using nanite foliage and all that stuff to just get a lot more detail. Because as we're seeing with a lot of modern games, the developers who are making these games in Unreal Engine 5 using nanite, where maybe just the rocks are nanite and everything else is LODs, well, we're seeing a lot of performance hits, and then that has to be made up for using DLSS. Here, we're really start on a strong foot here, getting, about 90 frames in this environment, and sort of staying consistently there, being able to add a lot more detail and getting a lot more performance back. Now, that being said, if I go into play mode here, again, we have a lot of optimizations to go in our own game, so the frame rate does drop on our end. However, even here in this mode, the frame rate is still better than when we were using masked foliage previously in this demonstration here. So this is the same environment. This is just before I swapped it to the nanite foliage. And as you can see with the nanite foliage right now, I'm getting about 20 frames more. And so what I'm getting at here is we're coming to a point in development where we really are being able to optimize properly in Unreal Engine 5 with nanite when using proper techniques. And those techniques are becoming more and more readily available, more and more widely known. And as that happens, things like DLSS and frame generation, they're not going to be so much a must-have in your game. And so all this being said, I think nanite, I think Lumen, I think it all has a really bright future. With every release Epic does, They seem to make it better and better, faster and faster, as well as including, more workflows and optimizations to go along with it. Now, again, after this video, I'll be working on a video showing how you can implement this, how you can properly use it, what are the settings you want to use, and all that good stuff, as well as how to create nanite foliage yourself. So stay tuned for that one. Until then, if you guys have any questions, comments, please go down the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you guys. You're also free to join the Discord, and we could talk about it there. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.